Steven Moffat is best known for co-showrunning the mega-hit BBC Sherlock series, as well as running the Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi years of Doctor Who. But where did his career begin? What was his first show? The answer is Press Gang. Press Gang was Moffat likes to characterise it as uncategorisable.
I happen to like comedy drama, I happen to like being not categorisable as either a comedy or a drama. I don't see why you should be. I don't see why humour should be a device that has to be isolated.
But it's easiest to say it was a children's comedy/drama, running 5 series from 1989 to 1993. It depicted the lives and activities of delightfully nuanced school children characters running a children's newspaper, and was noted for its witty comedy, as well as its surprisingly deft hand with drama and a rather popular romance story. This is the first in a series of podcasts and videos I'll be doing on Steven Moffat's fascinating body of work, looking at these deeply interesting shows on their own merits, and also looking at the greater story that starts to be spun out when taking a wider look at his career, how he and his writing developed over time. But this is a show that absolutely stands on its own 2 feet. A series with fantastically layered and developed main characters, unique and fascinating modes of storytelling, and the many curiosities of the work of a young man with a startling amount of creative freedom. Talking together about Press Gang today will be myself, Neo from Australia, as well as my fellow countryman Tomtit, and we'll both be joined by Bryn Mitchell from England and Hooligan from Canada. There's all sorts of topics we'll dive into, all sorts of interesting themes in the show, deep dives into the characters, juicy meta morsels about the show's production, interesting linkages to Moffat's later work, all sorts of exciting things. But first, in a little spoiler-free conversation, I'd like to ask you all why you think Press Gang still endures, why it still has dedicated fans, why there are still people buying the DVDs, or watching it on BritBox, or wherever else they watch it. What's made the show enduringly popular?
I think fundamentally, it is actually very good. There are so many shows where people will watch them because of the writer associated with them, because they think, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? That they, started with this, let's go back and see what it's like. And then they'll watch them and they'll be like, well, it's interesting. But Press Gang is genuinely very, very good and holds up easily against things that Moffat was writing, 30 years afterwards. I don't think, for me, I think it is one of the best bits of children's television of all time, and I think it's absolutely one of the highlights of Moffat's career, despite the fact it is the thing he started at with basically no script writing experience of any kind beforehand. And I think, it's also the fact that it's just so appealing to all audiences, I guess. I just think anybody can watch it.
Absolutely. Hooligan, what do you think?
I agree with a lot of that, but I would say the balance of comedy and drama in it, just they flow so easily into each other in Moffat's work, and it's just super entertaining. But I think also, the characters, they seem super relatable. There's a lot of focus on kind of their inner doubts and their feelings and whatnot. I don't know. I just feel like it's a show that, even though it's in some respects super dated, you look at it and you're like, that's so 90s, but you still get, you still understand them. It's still prescient, their issues that they go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Tomtit, why do you think the show still endures on?
There's something so sort of nostalgic about it. It belongs to the 90s, but even in the context of the 90s, it's right at the cusp of before they had computers. So they're still using typewriters and everything. And there's this sort of youthful sensibility to it. And I guess this sort of, the romance obviously is a gargantuan part of the compellingness of it. And I guess it's a very show about fetishizing work ethic as well. So there's kind of a weird inspirational / vaguely comedic aspect of seeing these kids basically masquerading as media people, essentially, / writers, because it's about journalism, but it's also, I think, a lot of it is a metaphor for figuring out how to write. There is a character who is a writer, but I think for all the characters, it's about how they reach people with the Gazette. It's very connected to Moffat sort of feeling his way through drama and comedy. You see why this show has become more popular than something like Joking Apart or Coupling.
And they were two later shows of Moffat's. Those were sitcoms, not occupying that kind of nebulous genre space of whatever you want to define press gang as.
It is very vague. It occupies a weird space in terms of genre because some of the episodes are outright thrillers. Some of them are more like a Doyle-esque mystery. And it's very just there is a weird sense that it's the sort of show where you feel like the characters could actually be in danger. And I feel like that level of threat and dramatic import lends itself to really strong fan attachment. It's such a sensational kind of show, and everything is so heightened because it's about the romantic years of, teenage life, and everything feels like it's the end of the world. And it really just captures that to a T.
Before we move into spoiler territory, I feel it's worth quickly noting how the series actually came to be.
Because you were a teacher just before you started writing this.
Oh, yeah. I'd only just quit. I was a teacher up until 87 or something like that.
Was it your dad that devised it?
Yeah, what it was, the background to this. My dad was at that time working on an education kit called the Norbridge Files, which was about a junior newspaper and how it worked. And it'd make the kids work on this junior newspaper. And he suggested to Bill Ward, who later directed some episodes of Press Gang, that this would be a great idea for a children's show. And he agreed, and a couple of years later, Sandra Hasty, with Bill Ward's girlfriend, got in touch.
A man called Bill Moffat, who's a head teacher in Johnston, Scotland, which is a very small town outside Paisley, had an idea to do an educational project, which was called the Norbridge Files,
and said, I'd like to develop this idea, but I have absolutely no money to give you. But will you let me develop it anyway? Yeah, well, they spoke a producer. And so my dad said, well, yes, that's fine. You can, but the price of doing this is that you have to let my son, because I was an aspiring writer doing theatre and stuff, you got to let my son do, an audition script. And Sandy sort of sighed and said, oh, God, all right, I'll read it. And then I'll get a proper writer. And so I sent in the script. And she loved it.
At the Edinburgh Festival that year, I happened to meet Lewis Rudd, who's the controller of young people's programs at Central. And being pushy and whatever, I said, I've got something I want to talk to you about. Because Lewis actually has the taste, I think, to see something that can be special.
I did think the script was very good was when I saw the first Steven Moffat script, which I think had a quality which is quite rare.
And with that kind of incredible sort of madness come genius of the woman, she just says immodestly, she just decided I would write the whole series.
Yeah.
So out of nowhere, from the school in Greenock, and longing to be a writer, out of nowhere, I just suddenly was with my own television show.
How amazing!
Just suddenly.
How incredible!
So with that, let's open the discussion up to any spoilers from the 5 series. To start with, what do we think of Lynda?
I mean, A, she's a fashion icon, clearly. B, she is just sort of, she's nothing like me, and yet at the same time she's very relatable. Because, I am not that assertive or bossy or that in control or anything, and yet there's something about the way she acts where everyone feels like that's what they could be like or what they would want to be like. And I think just there's a genuine realness there. I think there are so many stories that explore sort of the fallibility of her, while also never letting you forget that she is in complete control of that room when she needs to be. And there's just such a humanness there, and I think that's a huge part of it. And she's just brilliant, honestly. Yeah,
I really agree. I think she's sketched in such depth and detail that even if you're not really anything like her, she's realized as such a 3-dimensional human being that you can't help but connect with this person. Just they're so utterly real. I feel like they're springing off the screen into your mind. It's really quite something.
Overall, I'm very positive towards Lynda. I think she's clearly a successful character, and just you see the outpouring of love for her, even still. And I agree that like so much of what makes her successful is the fallibility, because like I think the mark of a good character is when the writer sort of allows them to be on the back foot and like wrong in a situation. There would be a risk when writing a character like Lynda. There would be sort of a impulse to make her just sort of right about everything all the time and just completely powerful. And like there would be a conception that is how you write a role model. But really it's so much more impactful when, like, say, even in series 1, there's like the episode where they're all trapped in not trapped, but they're all stuck in the office, the Night In episode.
Yeah.
Where it's all about how like her sort of refusal to be vulnerable and her sort of working through that. And it is all very focused on like her own negotiation with sort of her personality and how that causes difficulty for her, socially. And you don't always have to be nice to be kind. And it's like those sorts of bristly characters that Moffat likes to write. She is sort of, the earliest example of that. And in the later seasons, perhaps her characterization suffers a little bit because I think Moffat falls into that trap of turning her like hypercompetence into carte blanche for her to just walk all over everybody. And you can see Moffat sort of, how to put this, he's sort of like very excited by the idea of her being just like cruel and sadistic towards the Gazette. And it feels a little bit like she morphs into like Moffat's fantasy version of the character as she was in season 2, if that makes sense. Like she becomes an impression of herself a little bit.
Do you find what I find, particularly in the series 2 version of her, where there's like a very compelling interplay between, like, she obviously has a lot of self-doubt and self-loathing that she like papers up with her personality, but I find there's something interesting with how, like, she has this kind of misanthropic disgust towards other people, but she also has this kind of disgust toward herself at some of the time. I feel like that interplay there feels really three-dimensional to me. Do you see what I'm seeing there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of at the end of series 1 as well with the whole, shopping for dresses stuff.
Yeah.
It feels very like I think when Lynda behaves in that way, it's not Moffat trying to write what he thinks a teenage girl is like. I think it's more just tapping into like a more universal feeling of like inadequacy and it feels very authentic, and that's why I think it's so relatable and identifiable.
What do you think, Hooligan?
She definitely feels like a very real person, even though I can't say I know anyone like her in real life. But I don't know, I just feel like she's kind of like the linchpin of the series. Like I can't imagine Press Gang without Lynda Day,
Yeah, I think like the fact that she's a child who's acting like what children think adults are like. I think there's an easy sort of interpretation that all like her and a lot of the characters in it are just children who are acting like adults because they are effectively children in the roles of adults within this newspaper. I think what makes it is that actually it's how a child perceives an adult that she is. It's almost like she's living up to this idea of herself and projecting this image rather than that necessarily being complete. I'm sure it's a huge part of who she is, and yet you definitely get the sense that it's what she's projecting, because obviously there's deeper elements to her that comes out from time to time.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing the contrast between the childish and the kind of adult sides of her. I think there's that interesting moment in the series 2 premiere where she eggs on those troublemaking kids Colin works with to cut the hair of Spike's date. It's like such a childish thing to do, but it's so relatable for like a lovesick teen. But she's also so brilliant. Like she's such a good journalist, the way she's only interested in the truth and not her reputation or what anyone thinks of her. It's a real interesting cocktail of ingredients in her.
And there's definitely a childishness as well to her sort of her petulance and her not wanting to let things go, and yet that's also the things that makes her good as a journalist, the fact that she won't let something go just because it would be easier or like beneficial in the short term, which it's a very childish thing, that inability to let go, and it makes her good as a journalist. So those two things sort of come hand in hand, and it's quite a cleverly, it makes the whole concept of doing a show about children running a newspaper make a lot more sense when you think about it in those terms, when their childish characteristics are actually what makes them better at their jobs.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I feel like on another show, this character would come across really differently, because she's a control freak, she's very bossy, but it's not, I don't feel like we're viewing it from outside her, so there's no chance of really seeing her as shrewish or anything like that. We have such a sense of her interiority, like her self-doubt, occasional bouts of self-loathing and disgust, and the way her disgust with herself and her disgust with everyone else kind of plays into each other. It's all so layered that it feels like we're really inside of her mind. So it doesn't ever come across as this kind of... I mean, there's moments to dislike her, certainly, but I don't think she ever comes quite across as a condemnable character or someone to dislike or not to root for or anything like that, which is really interesting stuff.
And I think maybe, again, that is where the age comes into it. Maybe there's an argument that if you had a similar character as an adult and they still lacked that self-awareness and were still like that, they would be less likable. And I think, maybe there is a big influence of the fact that these characters are children that lets you get away with things in the writing and the characters still be likable that you wouldn't necessarily have as an adult. I mean, for example, it's kind of moving off topic with Lynda now, but Colin is a horrible person by any means, and yet if he was an adult, he would become so much, a million times worse. Like an adult character of Colin would just be so unwatchable, and that's not to say that this version of Colin isn't at times unwatchable, and yet you certainly get away with doing things with him because of him being a child that you couldn't do if he was an adult.
Yeah, it's like his youth makes him cartoonish, so it kind of dulls the edge of his insane capitalist tendencies. But even in series 5, I feel like he started to get a little bit more sexual, he was offering a bikini shoot to a journalist in the headmaster's office or something. And it was kind of starting to make me a little more uncomfortable, as everyone started aging and it started to all become more real and more defined what their personalities. It wasn't a kid playing it being a hardline editor. Lynda actually is an adult that's a hardline editor. It wasn't Colin's a young guy playing it being a really skeevy business figure, but he just is a skeevy business figure. I thought that was an interesting element as we moved into the later series.
The most interesting thing about Colin is the show sort of grappling with this sort of cute idea of a very young man who sort of has this entrepreneurial spirit, but then it grapples with the idea of what does that person become as an adult, because you see in the flash forwards he's a wildly unethical media tycoon, and Mr. Sullivan says he's going to hell, basically. I mean, that's Lynda's fantasy, but I think it's pretty reasonable to read that as it is a version of the kind of person he could become. And in the context of media, does Colin then go on to run a completely commercially interested newspaper and sort of weaken journalistic integrity across the board? And you see the show basically trying to create a version of Colin where he isn't that, and he actually is a positive sort of figure. So it's about taking his instincts and using them for good, basically, and his powers of negotiation in stopping the gun siege or helping to stop the gun siege. And in the Windfall episode, when he's faced with those thugs and he has to sort of use his charm to get out of that situation, it's a weird thing because Press Gang is sort of it's like a terrarium or something, or one of those little gardens in boxes where it's not really the real world. And you can tell Moffat, he wasn't fully thinking of Press Gang in terms of the real world. It's more like a Nancy Drew or Famous Five type situation where they're just solving mysteries and they're in their own little ecosystem. But it's when Press Gang actually has to engage with the real world that I think it sometimes falls down.
Yeah.
There's a weird tension between, real life and Press Gang life, basically.
I feel like the later series were handling that tension less well, but yeah, it's certainly a running theme of the series.
Yeah, I think I do have issues with the later series. I think on a one-on-one basis, there's still a lot of good episodes, and yeah, I think the premise is less strong because it's no longer really children running a newspaper, and it's no longer about the intersection between their school lives and their sort of work lives at the paper, and losing the sort of adult characters that are associated with the school, I think is a problem for similar reasons as well. So yeah, I think that is what you've just said plays into that as well, I think.
I think there's two. I really agree with that. I think there's two things that make the latest series an issue for me. One is that, like you were kind of saying, we don't really get so many episodes of the actual process of work, of actually running the paper, let alone the conflict with their childhood lives or anything. Like, we start getting these reels and reels of, the very special episodes, the very important episodes, or the structurally interesting episodes, which are like a Moffat mainstay. And that's all interesting, that's great, but it's like you kind of lose the spirit of a show without like the normalcy. It's like if Doctor Who stopped doing your standard type of monster episodes completely. I feel like you'd lose kind of grounding for everything else to orient around. And the other thing is, I just think the Series 2 finale is so perfect, and it's like such a logical conclusion to the show, that afterward it's just like they kind of have to spin the wheels and redux a lot of the late season 2 conflict just to kind of get the story engine kicking again. That's why we get the Spike, oh, is he going to go to America or not, repeated a lot, and kind of a will they, won't they thing, when like Series 2 kind of did that, and then we just kind of do it again. And there's a lot of great stuff in the last 3 series, but it does kind of feel like that essential story engine kind of bottomed out, at least to me. Did you guys feel that way?
Yeah, Series 2 ends it on like such an interesting question mark over not only Spike and Lynda's future, but also just their futures as people, and like, are they going to grow up or not? Series 3 to 5, I don't think ever satisfactorily answered that question, because in the immediate aftermath of that finale, you sort of expecting Lynda and Spike to maybe become more mature as people, but instead we get this really sort of comical story arc about stealing the passport, and it's basically like, you've almost never seen the characters behave so immaturely. First of all, it's not ethical. I mean, like, I really have problems with like the ultra controlling element of, having the lead character basically sabotaging Spike's life in that way. I think it's like, it's not as cute as the show thinks it is, really.
Yeah.
I guess it has echoes of like when like in Series 8 of Doctor Who, for instance, when Clara, does the gambit with the keys in Darkwater. But that's like after she's experienced a trauma, and it's in a dream, and it's, it's a more operatic sort of show, and it's less cute and more like the ultimate point of tension in that relationship. Whereas in Series 3, it's almost like a fetishy sort of game where it's like, hiding the passport, and that sort of interplay between them is like very sexually sort of tinged, and it's just a weird story beat, and the show never really figures out how to move beyond that sort of will they, won't they, inertia basically. And the show like starts to comment on this in a very self-effacing way about how the only way to sell the paper is to make it about Spike and Lynda.
Yeah.
And that feels very sort of self-defeating. Like it didn't have to be that way. I won't lie, I was very invested in Spike and Lynda's relationship, at least at first, but it gets to a point where like you have these scenes where the Gazette members are basically like grimacing and sighing and rolling their eyes whenever Spike and Lynda are doing their flirtatious shtick around like the office, and I'm basically like, I'm in the same place as the Gazette members are. I'm like, can we move this relationship on somewhere, please?
No, I definitely got that impression as well, that it just kind of starts spinning its wheels. Like in Series 5, like in the first episode, we were talking about Colin, and we have Colin doing the same story we've had for him, like for the third time, where he's like, oh, he can't talk to girls. It's like, we've done this, we've solved it like twice now.
I think that is it, because we can still watch. There are still episodes in those last 3 series which are very, very good, and yet it's there's something about the whole which kind of doesn't work anymore. And even I think the thing you said, especially about there being less actual work at the news, like last night I rewatched Love and War, which is a story in which it's all set in the newsroom at night and no newspaper making happens. And I think there are multiple stories in that later of the show that do that. I think the series 4 finale as well, where it's mostly, again, Lynda in the newsroom at night, having like the dream sequence. You know, it's all, it loses that sort of nitty gritty of them actually doing the job that is the premise of the show. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. It's kind of a learning experience. I imagine it was for Moffat, certainly, but also I think for us, like as the audience, it's kind of interesting to see. We all love like the treats of like the special episodes or the structurally crazy ones, but if you start just getting them over and over again, it kind of stops meaning so much. I wonder if Moffat kind of learnt that from Press Gang, because his latest shows, like Coupling, has a lot of playful episodes, but the bread and butter, you know, it keeps to a more standard thing. Certainly Doctor Who does. I wonder if that's something he kind of learnt from what was going on in the last few series here.
I think the Coupling comparison is interesting, because Coupling, like, there's a few other episodes that do bits and pieces, but fundamentally each of the 4 series has one episode that is like a major sort of structurally, you know, weird one, and that is their, like, you know, special episode for that year. And so like that one, the fact that it's one a year, it seems like it's very aware of not doing this every week and doing this as a special thing. Whereas, like you say, Press Gang, it's kind of, there's very much a sense of Moffat is always writing what he wants to write, which I think brings up, you know, excellent and great results. And yet it very much seems like if he's not interested in telling a story, even if that story would, you know, suit the show or fill in the details, then it's kind of like, well, no, I'm just going to write what I think will be, you know, whatever idea comes up next and what I think will be fun.
Yeah, I think it's true that Coupling, it doesn't really have meme episodes or structurally experimental episodes, if you want to put it legitimately. It doesn't have as many of those as it's reputed to. It's sort of like being experimental is the norm for Coupling. Like every episode, it sort of jumps back and forth in time to the point where you stop sort of noticing it. And it's really only, in episodes like Split or I guess the series 4 opener, it's really reserved for openers, series of Coupling. But Press Gang, I guess, the gimmick episodes, it would be more accurate to call them like drama episodes or episodes where the characters are in a heightened state of danger. They become the norm in like series 3 to 5.
Yeah.
I don't know. The tone of those later series, it's almost like, you could almost describe it as like, it feels like an old-timey like noir series, or like it becomes more like a detective agency akin to Sherlock or something. You can feel Moffat almost wishing he was writing about, like detectives rather than journalists. I guess there's an obvious connection, but just in the way that they carry out their work. I suppose you'd call them filler episodes of the earlier series, episodes where it's just sort of hanging around the office and just getting through the work of the day. I think Moffat expressed a desire or a regret that he didn't write more of those later on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with that. It's better to have light and shade and sort of slow down so that it doesn't just feel like every week the Junior Gazette is faced with some sort of crisis or apocalyptic scenario.
Yeah, there's that line in that Series 2 unfinished documentary on the DVD where Moffat says something like,
as I say, when you're doing it like once a fortnight, when you come up with a new idea once a fortnight, it's not so much, you're not sort of sitting around waiting. I mean, inspiration doesn't come to you if you sit around waiting for it in the bath. You know, you sit and stare at the typewriter and think there must be some interesting way of having Spike come through the door.
Yeah, you can feel that. You can feel that here. I think on that whole lack of work or process of work episodes in the last three series, it's interesting because I feel like that's such a huge core of the show, is this kind of idea, this theme of work can be fulfilling, work can you can be taken seriously through your work, the collaboration of work is important, work can kind of improve you, young people can get taken seriously through doing their work, they can make a difference through their work. I feel like that's so key to probably why young people like this show so much, because it's kind of empowering to say, the show's like saying young people can totally do this if they put in the work, and then it's like a power fantasy of, you can affect change, through doing, it doesn't have to be a newspaper, but by going out and, collaborating with people, you can actually do things. Do you guys get a big sense of that?
Yeah, I think that is a huge element of like the idea that it's a work environment that allows them to sort of express themselves. And there's constantly, whenever there's the conflict in the series that comes up, especially in the first two series, between school and the newspaper, the series always sort of errs on the side of actually the newspaper is going to give them more experience. It's more like life, because there's I think there's an interesting bit in one of the series 2 episodes where the headmaster is trying to suggest to Lynda that they should be pausing the paper for exams, and he literally says, this newspaper isn't going to get you a job, but your exams might, which of course is the opposite really of how reality works. And I remember hearing that and thinking, well, that's a bit, that feels a bit like we've missed the point there. And then immediately afterwards, it is the person from the radio channel who's there to do the interview offering her a job, and you're like, oh no, okay, so the script is very aware of what the headmaster is saying is complete rubbish, basically. Yeah.
It's interesting sort of in comparison to Chalk, where like Chalk has such a negative view of basically education.
Chalk, of course, is Moffat's 1997 sitcom set in a school. Moffat's least known show. The show he's notably not that proud of as well. And yeah, of course, there is that kind of negative view towards education in that show.
Whereas Press Gang is obviously like, these kids are, totally transcending their the limits of what their experiences are supposed to be like by embarking on this professional endeavor. It's like, doing a comparison of the two series, like it's pretty clear Moffat is suggesting that if you sort of follow your own path, then you'll be happy. And if you stay, it's sort of like a pro dropping out of school message, which is interesting. You see that echoed sometimes in like wildly successful artists who had success by breaking off and doing their own thing.
It's interesting to hear it from a former teacher, because Moffat, of course, was a teacher before he got into television. So a former teacher saying, do what I do and get out of school. It's kind of amusing.
Yeah.
It's interesting to center like ostensibly a children's show around work, like in such a way. Like you'd feel that this would come across as boring or laboured, but it really just seems to take young people at their level like so seriously. Like it's never talking down. So many people say this about the show. It never feels like it's talking down to people. It's amazing how much that really works. You treat children like adults or just like regular people, and they really, really respond to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that, it's children doing work and that's how is that appealing to children? And yet, if you think about the sort of contemporary things around it, like Grange Hill and Children's Ward, it's like, Grange Hill it's in a school, it's children, so the children watching it get home from school and then sit and watch other children at school. And then Children's Ward is, a children's ward. None of these are inherently very exciting or enjoyable environments necessarily. And yet, obviously, the characters draw people in.
Another idea in the show, this might be a little bit more obtuse, but that I felt like I got out of it. And this is another like pretty... It feels wrong to say adult, like as a compliment to an aspect of the show, given like the show's basis. But something pretty developed that feels to me is this kind of idea of love not being enough, like for people or like for relationships. We get these situations where characters caring about each other isn't enough to stop them hurting each other or making things worse for each other. Like we get this very much with Lynda and Spike a lot, where Spike's more realistic about the relationship, and he's like questioning, in series 2, if her career soars, can it really work out between them? We get that in that excellent episode, except for one bit of it, Colin's costume at the party, which really interrogates a lot of this. Do you guys get what I'm talking about out of the show at all?
Yeah, I think the relationships in it, it's like everything we're saying about it, we're talking about really. It's played as if it's between adults, and the relationship is as complicated and as nuanced as any relationship between adults, which I think is realistic to how, when you are that age, how a relationship feels. Like every argument you have feels as serious as anything else. You're not sat there as a teenager thinking, oh well, I'm only a teenager, so how I feel at the moment doesn't matter. And it does do genuine deep exploration into that, doesn't it? Yeah.
You can sort of look at the entire Spike Lynda relationship as like a battle between basically hard work as represented by Lynda and natural talent and charisma as represented by Spike. And it's sort of the idea that like Spike in the short term will be able to make lots of connections because he is so effortlessly sort of charming and clever. But because Lynda presumably had these values of like hard work and resilience sort of drilled into her from a young age, or it's not exactly clear where she got those values from, but like I think it's pretty safe to assume that Spike, his upbringing was much more sort of, he had to be independent and sort of subsist himself, which like having to do that sort of doesn't give you as much time to maybe to focus on like studies, or because he's shown to have a very sort of fraught upbringing. So it's like it's this very fatalistic. He thinks he won't be able to transcend basically his background, and I think the At Last the Dragon episode is like pretty much the thesis statement on this, and it's like, for my money, one of the best episodes in the show. Yeah. Because it works as just like a self-contained sort of date movie, basically. But it's that thing of like Spike feels like he has a dark cloud around him, which is that he's perceived as sort of just a like a chaotic, like a Bart Simpson figure, basically. I can't think of how else to describe it, but like just this like scrappy guy, and Lynda is just such a clearly such a cultivated personality. Like she just emanates professionalism at the expense of like her own friendships and everything. So it's that whole tension, and it's also because like they both offer the things to each other that they would feel that they are deficient in themselves. Like Lynda is abundantly hardworking and sort of competent, and Spike is just like, he clearly knows how to enjoy life, and he's like so comfortable in his own skin. It's like, it makes perfect sense why they're attracted to each other, basically.
It's interesting how like most people would read Lynda as more mature because of the work ethic and her station in life and everything, but I feel like Spike, because of his less coddled experiences in life, has a much more nuanced and developed view on like emotional realities. I'm just repeating your observations back to here.
Yeah.
But things like how the delaying of the everyday domesticity of the relationship, with how she doesn't want to make it public, is kind of crucial because it's threatening to Spike, because he's going to fear a lack of longevity in their relationship as their lives move on. It's not a gender thing. Like, Spike doesn't strike me as the macho type of guy to be worried about a scenario where Lynda was earning more money than him in a swanky job or anything. It's more just that he kind of feels like in a potential future like that, they wouldn't be together, which is represented by his dream with her in the high-rise building and everything, of course. The fear that he'd stick out at those kind of parties we see in that excellent episode, that hotshot news moguls would judge him and Lynda. Well, I'd ask what you have to say for that, but that is what you had to say about that.
Yeah. And I think it's very like, during the best sort of series and episodes of Press Gang, Moffat really digs deep sort of past the cliches, or like the first thing you would think to write. Because I think with Lynda wanting to keep the relationship secret, I think you can see that she sort of assumes that Spike would be okay with that, because Spike, he is sort of the happy-go-lucky sort of, I don't know how you describe it, like a Lothario sort of.
Yeah.
She assumes that he would be happy just like scurrying in and out of windows, but actually he wants like something more consolidated or stable.
It's like the stability is exciting to him because that's outside of his norm, whereas for Lynda it's the other way around, because most things are stable for her, so being daring is the exciting thing out of her norm.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Spike is such an endlessly fascinating character because, like, I think in the context of the show, he is sort of the idealized, like, romantic figure rather than an audience identification type character. He is essentially James Dean walking into Lynda's life and sort of, upending everything. And it's like, yeah, it feels so, I guess it's like kind of bold in like the extent to which we are identifying with Lynda. I guess it's, Moffat really captured that effectively, I think.
Because I've never been a 17-year-old girl, it's rather interesting to think like one, or to force yourself to consider the world from that perspective.
I love that line. That's, of course I love you, but what good does that do to either of us? I'm not ready for this. I just want to run a newspaper. I love how that's so much more complicated than you'd expect a love story to be. Like, yes, they love each other, but that's not the ending of a story. That's just like another step as their lives keep going on. I really love that element of it.
And it can't help but wonder how much of stuff like that, like, is influenced by Moffat's personal life at the time. Certainly, by the time the Series 2 finale is coming, I mean, it's the Series 2 finale that has Brian Magboy, isn't it? So obviously
the context for this Brian Magboy we're mentioning is that...
Here's a factoid. I have made various allusions to the fact that during this series I wasn't having a very happy home life, which in fact my wife and I, my then wife, were separating, and she ran off with someone called Brian. And this is the character I introduced to represent my my wife's new boyfriend, Brian Magboy.
Is it?
Brian, Maggie's boy, yeah. So I just brought him into the programme and had him injured by various people. It was the only thing I could do.
I can't claim to have particularly great insight into Moffat's relationship, but it may well be that, that thought process of, oh, well, you can love someone and they can love you, but that's not the be-all and end-all because there's so many other factors in a relationship. You imagine that comes from experience, certainly.
I feel like people can hear this like biographical reading of Moffat's shows and like go, oh, that's a bit scandalous, or that's a bit much. But then you watch Joking Apart and it's like, it's like completely unavoidable. Or even coupling with the names of the two main characters. Like he's begging for you to read it this way.
Yeah, and
really.
like, chalk as well, it's about a teacher. Like it's kind of, it's very, like if anything, Press Gang, prior to sort of Doctor Who and his work post that, Press Gang is probably the least obviously based off of his own life, and certainly, I know as a writer, most of the things I write on the surface level have nothing to do with my own life, and yet almost every element of them is based off of my feeling on a situation that's happened, or my thoughts and my because you can't really base off of anything else. The old adage is write what you know, and obviously that doesn't have to mean literally write your own life, but whether you're writing sci-fi or fantasy or children running a newspaper, to a greater or lesser extent you're going to be writing from your own experience, because that is just what influences all writing, really.
I think there's a sort of funny irony that like so much of the show is about the idea of working hard and sort of pushing your way through and making your voice heard, when in light of that, like you think of how Moffat did not come into this job of managing a children's show through the traditional way. Like he got it because of who his dad is. Which isn't to say that it's like a nepotistic thing, because I'm sure like the guy who had the Press Gang script given to him, he expected to just dismiss it. Obviously, we can see from the show that it is really well written. So it's not like, he got the job just because he's Bill Moffat's son.
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating when someone nepotistically gets a great job, but they deserved it anyway. It's because there's not so much to rage at. It's not so much to rage at then, because like I'm happy he's making TV, and I roll my eyes at him getting a job that way, but like I'm still happy he's in the position. Such is life, I suppose.
On the topic of writing what you know, I think this show is sort of probably a good example of why that is a good idea, because I think like there is a version of Press Gang where it is extremely about the actual mechanics of running a newspaper. And I'm sure if Moffat had tried to write that show, it wouldn't have been very interesting or good.
Like the newsroom.
Like the newsroom was, yeah. But you can see Moffat basically trying to entertain himself by writing this romance of epic proportions and, like gun sieges, and that's a more complicated example. But I think whatever you can say about the gun siege episode, I think you can tell that Moffat is really engaged with what he's writing.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of just like you can only write things that are autobiographical. It's sort of more about just it's always a good idea to direct things towards emotions or structures which you understand personally.
Sometimes it's writing what you know isn't so much writing the autobiographical things. It's kind of the opposite. It's finding the commonality that isn't specific to you, that it's something everyone has or everyone goes through. And then it's not really writing like autobiographically in terms of, I literally went through this specific divorce, I'm going to write about it. It's talking about there's a universal human experience not specific to me that I can write about because I'm a human, therefore I went through it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Russell T Davies, who said that...
Yes. With these tragic lives, you think, oh my God, that person's lived. How can I ever equate with that sort of person? There's an awful feeling that actually dogs you your entire adult life. I might as well be addressing this to 50-year-old writers who are sitting there thinking, oh, I haven't lived. I have no experience. When I keep told to write what you know, I don't know anything. I haven't done. The truth of it is you have. It's when people say write what you know, you don't have to have been a drug addict. You don't have to have been hanging off the edge of a cliff. You don't have to be divorced. I should have turned my phone off. It's but you should. It's like it doesn't mean you need to have cataclysmic life experiences. Yeah. You can write about what you know if you were ever lonely in school.
Yes, yeah.
Who wasn't lonely in school? Absolutely everybody was lonely in school. And everyone has wanted to kill someone. Most of us haven't killed someone, but everyone has hated someone so much they want to kill them, especially when you're young, especially when you're 13. That's when you actually want to kill them. And everyone has been in love, and everyone's been in unrequited love.
Yes.
So the notion, when it says write what you know, you must realise that you know an awful lot.
You're literally feeling inadequate in that stance if you feel like you haven't had enough cool experiences in your life, and therefore you have something you can draw on to write a great, relatable story.
Yeah, exactly. This is all relevant because press gang is pretty much about writing.
Yeah, there's an interesting point with that as far as it goes with him writing Lynda, who's obviously much less similar to him than Mark from Joking Apart or Steve from Coupling, in that she's a 17-year-old girl at the start, and her personality is not quite a clone Moffat's like some of his other protagonists are. There's some interesting Moffat quotes about how he says at one point he got notes that you've got to show that Lynda's vulnerable on the inside, and he replied back in the day, everybody's vulnerable on the inside, that's not a revelation, she's not a particularly vulnerable person, and why aren't you saying that about any other character in this show? So I feel like he seems like he's kind of prickling at what I think he might be interpreting as like a sexist complaint about how Lynda's written. Like he's in that same article that quotes from, he says, I never lived in a time when there weren't loads of women in authority. Press Gang was run by a woman, the producer. So it's interesting. Do you think he was... How do you think it goes him inhabiting this character that's not as like superficially identical to him as some of his other leads?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting there that those quotes suggest a sort of greater awareness of, the importance of writing this character and how she's written than we might necessarily think of from Moffat from his later work.
Yeah.
I struggle sometimes when Moffat is labelled as a feminist writer because I think he's written things that have feminist themes, and yet I don't think he would use the label feminist to describe himself. And so that makes me sometimes think that there's a tendency to over-egg how feminist he is, and obviously there are also things he's written that, if you took those on their own would suggest absolutely the opposite. So,
for sure.
But yeah, I think clearly Lynda is a very well-written female character, undeniably, and hugely influential. And I think it's possible, that was a fairly recent interview, I think, that those quotes from. I seem to remember reading it. And
yeah, I think it was from May this year.
Yeah, and so obviously it's entirely possible that is sort of post-rationalizing on his part, that he's applying these ideas to it. But it's clear that he, I think whatever reason we put behind it, he succeeded in writing a very well drawn and very powerful, female protagonist, and the show hugely benefits from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very reductive to try and boil Moffat down to like he's a completely straightforward feminist, despite what he might say about himself or what a lot of his work says. And in the same way, it's you can't ignore the characters like Lynda, as well written as they are. Yeah, he's a very interesting man to talk about, and his work's very interesting to talk about. I think they defy easy categorization, like he says about Press Gang itself. What do we think about Kenny? Because that's quite a different character to Colin and Lynda.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's there to offset Lynda. Clearly it's a case. It almost feels like, obviously, again, I don't know the writing process, but it feels like you've come up with this sort of hard-laced Lynda as the editor, so then when you're trying to come up with the co-editor, you sort of come up with the opposite of that. And I do think there's something very enjoyable about the fact that Kenny is the opposite of Lynda, and yet they both clearly get on with each other really well. And I think that speaks really true to the sort of friendships you might have at that age, where you can be complete opposites in personality and characteristics and still just have this history and this friendship that just means you get on.
I love Kenny. When you look at like the arc with the woman from Dublin and that whole arc, I think it was really clever of Moff to write an episode which sort of it draws attention to like the fact that Kenny is so passive.
Yeah.
And it's like very intelligent on his part that rather than like sort of ignoring that, he makes it the subject of a story.
Do you recall on that unfinished Series 2 documentary on the DVD, Moffat says he identifies by far the most with Kenny and his passivity? I thought that was interesting.
I like writing Kenny because he's just like me, really. And he can say all the rather doleful things about life that I do from time to time.
Definitely. And I think that makes sense. I think the most obvious like parallel to another Moffat character would be Rory, in that he's just like the quiet, understated version of basically how to be a good dude. And I think, he works in that context. Absolutely.
Yeah. This isn't like a revelatory character moment, but the moment that always sticks out in my head is there's an early Series 2 episode where Sam just like objectifies him, and I think randomly tells him,
Sam, please.
Are you telling me you wiggle like that and don't know it?
And it just struck me so much on first watch as a surprise. Whenever I think about Kenny, it pops into my mind.
There's an interesting thing about the fact that if you watch Series 2, I think especially the sort of third and fourth times I watched it, it seems there's an interpretation that Sam actually is genuinely interested in Kenny and genuinely has a bit of a crush on him, and yet anytime she sort of makes a comment that suggests as much, Kenny sort of laughs at it, not in a mean way, but just in a way of assuming that she's kind of playing with him. Like it's a very difficult relationship to pin down, and yet the more I watch it, the more I think, because she seems genuinely disappointed when he kind of, I don't know, I think there's something to be said about those two and what might have been.
Yeah, it's interesting because he has all that focus on destiny and chance and fate in that Misconnections episode, so that really plays into it. If he was misinterpreting Sam, it's like having him on where she might have been quite sincere, in fact. That's quite interesting.
And yeah, I have no idea if that's intentional, and yet, it may be something that came out more in the performance than the script, but the more I think about it, the more I start, which I guess is a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy thing, where once you become aware of it on some level, then you start spotting it everywhere, even in places that it isn't. But I wonder whether that would have gone somewhere if Sam wasn't just in the second series, but I don't know. I always think of going back to Jasper Street, which is one of my favourite episodes, and the bit in that when they've gone up to the house and Lynda knocks on the door and Kenny says, do you remember when we used to do this and then run away? And Lynda says, I ran away, you stayed and apologised. And I think that perfectly sums up them and their relationship. It's one of my favourite just lines and moments in that. And yeah.
What about Spike. We haven't really talked much about Spike yet. What do we think of that character?
I think it makes sense for him to have an accent because it sort of puts him at a remove from all the other characters. And like, if he had just spoken in like a London accent, then I think he would have blended in too much. I definitely don't think it's a good accent. Like, I think, you know, you don't have to be like a linguist to point out examples of like Americans don't really like exaggerate the in every single word, which Dexter sometimes does. I think that like it's pretty impressive how he still sort of conveys such humanity through that accent.
Another quote that sticks in my mind is in the second episode of series 1.
So go.
I'm gone.
Goodbye.
You must fancy her rotten. Who? Lynda? Drink her bathwater.
That's aged interesting.
Is this the original, like, that's so funny because all I can think of is jokes about Gamer Girl bathwater now, which was very much not a thing in 1989, but...
Only in Moff's mind.
Yeah, no, with Spike, I get the sense, like, some of his early lines don't really stick it for me, but kind of later on, he kind of more comes into, I guess, an entertaining character. But I guess what I was going to say about kind of Kenny and whatnot is you kind of need the kind of less stated characters, like I guess Kenny and like Sarah and stuff, when you have like these kind of exuberant personality characters like Spike who are like really out there in your face and always cracking jokes.
Yeah. And I think just in terms of, you know, so Kenny and Spike as the main men in the series are very different from each other and occupy very different roles. I guess it's interesting really that actually a lot of it comes back to their relationship to Lynda with all the sort of characters in terms of how different they are. You know, you can characterize, you know, Sarah as Lynda's friend as like a key. There's multiple stories that play on that, and Kenny as Lynda's best friend, and then Spike as Lynda's love interest. Whereas if you try and characterize the character, like what Spike is to Kenny, it's harder to do because like you know they are obviously friends that got on all right and they work together, but it's not as clear. You know, it feels like the characters sort of orbit around Lynda, other than maybe like Fraz, I guess you could argue doesn't really. But yeah, and I think that's obviously Spike is the key example of that because he's any other character. Obviously, characters leave as the series goes on. You know, Kenny leaves after the end of series 3, and obviously, you know, graphics changes. You know, every year almost, except for the last 2. The fact that Lynda and Spike are basically the 2 characters. I feel like if they left, it would be a different show.
Yeah,
that you couldn't replace as easily. You know, it's their show. It's their dynamic that is kind of everything else is built around.
The Spinda show. The other thing I was going to say I liked about Spike was kind of how he uses jokes as like a kind of coping mechanism to kind of deal with difficult things in life. And I just find that's something that's very true to life. Like whenever you're having a hard go, easiest way to get through it is to joke about it, you know?
Yeah, it's why I feel like the success and failure rate of his jokes are like works for the show. Like I think it works that a ton of them really don't land because he's not like meant to be sincerely funny all the time. He's meant to be a guy trying to be funny all the time, which is a distinct thing.
Yeah, and I think the show does genuinely, you know, despite the fact that a lot of the thing, it's kind of things he says that are cheesy and stuff sometimes not funny, and yet the show does have a very good laugh rate. I think like it has a lot of one-liners for something that is also so dramatically hefty. Like this. Just, I can think off the top of my head of just like brilliant one-liners in that show. Like the one that always comes back to me is in series 1 when they have the birds and Colin suggests shooting them. And Lynda says, "What about animal preservation?" And he says, "What? You mean like in the freezer?" Like it's, you know, it's a genuinely really funny show, and any conversation we might have about the depth of the characters and the cleverness of the stories and all this stuff sort of praising Moffat, I think it's easy to forget that like I like shows that don't have a laugh track, because sometimes you get moments in Press Gang where if it had a laugh track, the scene would be about twice as long, because if you were pausing after every single joke, you know, and that's the pace at which Moffat writes jokes where it's just like boom, 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 wouldn't suit you know, a live audience. I know obviously, you know, later on in his career, Coupling had a live audience, but the style of jokes in Press Gang wouldn't work for that, I think.
Yeah.
And actually, in terms of that, I'm kind of completely removed from whatever the original question that started this spiel was now, but having brought up the thing about it not being a live studio audience, I think it's worth referring to the way it is filmed, because for a comedy and for a children's show, it's shot and directed in a very sort of, not necessarily high budget, but like it's all the location filming and the style of filming with the camera movements. There's a lot of stories about the director wanting to get in their tracking shots, and how Steven would have to make up more dialogue just to fill how long the director wanted their shot to be.
So I used to time it really very carefully, those scenes where you and Dexter would come racing through the door and argue all the way to your desk.
Yeah.
And they shortened that distance, and it never worked quite as well.
Yeah, it was very hard to time that.
And Bob Spiers, a very wonderful director, used to call me down from my office saying, I've got this great tracking shot, but I need about 4 more lines. And I was writing footage of lines. So how many? Oh, about 6 feet. Okay. Until I started getting arsy in later series and saying, oh, move that camera quicker.
And because it's a very visually, it just stands out in amongst children's shows and comedy shows. And for some reason, it's shot basically like a cheap film, but a film nonetheless. And the directors associated with it are very, respected, directors, and that comes across. I think it's the majority of it is Bob Spiers, isn't it? Who obviously is very, and yes, he doesn't get to do all of it, but it's clearly his style that comes across in the ones that he doesn't do. He's known for the tracking, wanting to use loads of tracking shots, and obviously then the other directors kind of base off of that. And I think it fits with the pace of the dialogue. It gives the show a feeling like it's an energy and that it's constantly moving through these tracking shots. So I think it's clever in that respect. And the fact that it's all shot on film allows for faster editing, which again, pacier. So yeah.
I think the 16mm film that it was filmed on has made it age quite interestingly. In the exterior scenes, the light is so garish. It's a really different texture than you'd get with something filmed on videotape. So I think it is quite a unique look to it. And the way it uses dreams so much, this is shows like The Sopranos were doing that, or Twin Peaks in the 90s as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it really does give it this more, I feel like prestige is kind of silly, but it doesn't feel like its peers, on television. Yeah.
I think that because it's shot on film, I think even it already has aged better than Joking Apart or Coupling, although I think Coupling is a nice looking show, but I think Press Gang looks so just warm in its presentation, and being shot on film just contributes to that overall sense of nostalgia and love of old media that you get from watching it now. And one thing I love in particular is that because of just the quality of the audio tape that I guess it's recorded on, that as soon as you start every single episode, there's a bit of tape distortion in the theme music, so it's off pitch.
Yes, yeah.
And it's sort of it starts out off pitch, then it warps, it adjusts into the correct pitch, and it's not intentional at all, I assume, but it's makes it feel so homemade, and it's very suiting for the Junior Gazette, which is such a homemade enterprise. But yeah, I think it's a very pretty show, and it has that otherworldly quality that something like Twin Peaks has, or the original Twin Peaks. Part of that whole weird otherworldly vibe is the sense that the show is kind of escaping the limits of its own genre in the way that Twin Peaks sort of stretches out of being a soap opera. When you see things like the Junior Gazette sort of responding to a gun siege, or people getting trapped under burning buildings or stuck in vaults, there's a sense of this isn't supposed to be happening. It's all very dreamlike and constructed, but in a way where it makes you care about the characters.
On that point of I don't think you were referring to the financial reality of the Gazette when you said this shouldn't be happening, but something that confused me sometimes is, so after series 2 there are 2 newspapers where the Gazette is. So there's the adult newspaper that the Brigadier runs, and there's and Matt DeCur runs, and then there's the Junior Gazette, which is its own commercial enterprise. And so it's targeted to children, but I'm confused on what is meant to be making it so distinct as to give it like financial feasibility. Is it literally just that kids, it's like a thing for kids are going to read this paper? Because I feel like that's not a very profitable consumer base. Maybe I'm reading way too much into it and I should just accept it's a bit more cartoonish, but do you get my kind of confusion with... I know the Gazette was struggling all the time, but I'm still kind of confused at why people would be reading a junior newspaper at all, as well written as it surely was.
I think, I'm not sure it makes sense, but I think the like press gang takes place in a world whereas in our world, we have like children's publications that just talk about like, I don't know, comic books and skateboarding. I think Press Gang takes place in an alternate universe where like you have an adult newspaper and they just talk about like oatmeal and retirement.
You know what it is?
Yeah.
It reminds me of Steven Moffat's 2017 quote where he said, "By imagining a better world, we will bring it forth."
Yes.
So perhaps he wanted to create a world where children would be super hooked into newspapers.
Yeah. But as to why people read the Junior Gazette, I'm not sure. Maybe it's, I don't know. I was just about to say maybe it's because it uses like simpler language, but like newspapers already do that.
Yeah.
So I really don't know.
This might be actually one of the things where it's a bit of a generational gap with the show, in that, like, for us, a lived reality of the 2010s, now the 2020s, is how utterly unfeasible, newspaper businesses are. Starting in 1989, less the case. So maybe it wouldn't have been seen as crazy back then for like two newspapers to somehow be chugging along. Whereas now, like, I'm kind of scoffing at even one of them getting a consistent readership.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that was part of why I think like watching Press Gang now, it has a really like slightly melancholic edge to it, because there is a very real sense of like this couldn't happen today.
No.
Yeah. And that's sort of that's ties into the romance as well, which is in a much more like faffy poetic sense. It's like Spike and Lynda are in some senses doomed, or at least they feel like they are doomed.
Yeah. And she's literally doomed. She goes to hell in the finale.
Right. Or so some would say. Yes.
I think a common thread with a lot of the characters is the way they approach honesty differently, or pragmatism differently. Like, some characters are delicate, like Kenny, and some are like brutally honest to a fault, like Lynda. And I think Lynda and Colin have interesting commonalities and contrasts. Like, they have an actual exchange about that in one episode, but also it's like Lynda is super honest, Colin is, dishonest to his ends. Lynda doesn't care about social acceptability. Colin is obsessed with exploiting it, which is caring about it, but not like in the way you would expect. And he can navigate the social realm well, where she can't. I feel like this is a really key kind of thing to like the differences between the characters, is how they approach that, how they approach being honest in society. How do you guys read that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because actually that sort of thing of whether you're frankly honest or whether you want to be sort of nice to the point of failing to get the point across, that probably the moment that interrogates that most is, I believe it's in series 2, and it's the bit where Sam wants to fire someone from the graphics team, and it's like, she asks this person into the room, and then it just can't do it, and then the exact same thing, it repeats itself with Kenny. And I think what's interesting about that one is it kind of, obviously it builds to the point where Linda's like, oh, I'll just do it, and yet she as well, in that specific circumstance, for whatever reason, isn't quite able to say it, and you end up with the bit where the person who's supposed to be getting fired tells Lynda that she's leaving anyway, so Lynda just gets the person to pretend that she's just fired her, basically, which is interesting, and it's sort of, I think it speaks to the idea that Lynda is sometimes more her reputation than she actually is herself, because you would expect her to just go in there and have no issue with firing her, and yet, and that's how it comes across, and how, from Kenny and Sam's perspective, they see that it's played out, and yet there is actually this bit where Lynda's, reached the same floor as them despite what we would associate with her. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, why in that specific context she isn't that brutally honest, like what it is in that with there. I'm not sure.
And she's not always honest with herself either. Like in that series 2 episode with the party and the Colin issue, where she like psychs herself up to go to this, and it's a work thing, like it's networking, it's still a part of the newspaper job she's meant to be great at, but she says, I'm not very good at social stuff, let's forget this and go somewhere else. She's very grateful how Spike initially is like enabling her leaving, then he does his noble man thing of forcing him back in, saying it's going to hurt him more than it hurts her, to try and finagle that situation correctly. So it is interesting how she copes, with how she navigates the kind of situation. Just, it's like she can talk so strongly, but she can't talk non-confrontationally so well. Like she has that hiccup gag. It's not dissimilar to how Colin says he can't talk normally because no one expects him to talk normally. So how can he, go about that? It won't work. It's like how he's like the boy who cried wolf in the abuse episodes in series 2.
Yeah, like you say, no one believes him, and frankly, why would Lynda believe that he's given her the real finances or whatever? And I think having brought up that story, it's probably worth talking about it in more detail, because it is it's probably the most, people who have never seen Press Gang know that it does an episode on that issue, and it's a very, very well written, but also it's interesting how it strikes a balance between being a children's show and yet, I can watch it as an adult and really find it hard to watch, while on like a pure like content level, it keeps everything off screen, and even in the dialogue is quite, tame in what it describes. And just as soon as you put but it's genuinely gives me a really strong emotional response every time. Like we're talking like tears, violent crying, and I think that speaks to something about how it's written, but it's PG effectively, and yet far more impactful than anything much more detailed or whatever. So I think I'd be interested to hear yours two's thoughts on that particular story as well, because it is such a significant part of Press Gang.
What really works for me in it is when the Gazette are workshopping the piece they're going to run on it, the issue they're going to run on child abuse, and Colin's really stringent on them not writing it in a way that'll be moralizing for the writers, but writing it in a way that actually convinces the kids in bad situations. That was powerful to me, because it's
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's easy the right word, but the way writers tend to go around this kind of thing is writing it in a way that makes sense to writers, writing it in a way that seems moral and strong for them, but not in a way that's necessarily speaking to the actual children, but the way Colin's like thinking of but she'll still think like this, how do we reach that aspect of what she'll be thinking? I thought that was really fantastic, really rounded way to do it.
Yeah, I think that scene is it's like a masterclass in writing, in the sense that it's clearly getting across because obviously that, they consulted with the, is it the NSPCC, and that scene is the one where you can very clearly hear all the points being brought up in that scene of the things that the NSPCC has told them will include this, and yet it does it in a way that absolutely fits in with the drama, and even with, it's got all the characters in the scene and the questions they raise about what it is that the child might still think that might still be an obstacle for them telling. When they raise those points, you feel like which points that they raise as different people is relevant to their character as well. And I think that's what makes that scene so clever. It's getting across a very real point, but is obviously reflecting the real world. And it's a scene with a point to get a very specific message to the audience, while also just being completely, everyone's written in character and everything's written naturally as it would occur. And I think the newsroom setting obviously helps with that, but it's just, I think I always come back to that scene as an example of how to write issue-based storytelling in a really effective way.
It's extremely meta, because it's like the members of the Gazette are figuring out how to write the message to reach out to people who might be dealing with abuse, and Moffat is doing the exact same thing in the episode. It's like, yeah, how do you communicate this properly?
Yeah, there's a interesting Moffat quote that I feel frames this kind of thing interestingly, where he says, "I suppose the child abuse episodes were pretty tricky. In general, I didn't like doing issue episodes. They always seemed patronising, and if I wanted advice on a serious subject, the last person I would ask would be some damned telly writer. What do we know? Nothing. That's what." I feel like I'm surprised for a few reasons out of that. Like, one is him saying he doesn't like doing issue episodes, where I feel like the series was absolutely rife with them, so that surprises me. I don't know if that was coming from top down, like he was being I know he was advised to do a drug episode, and the ultimate finale is in part a response to that, but it's strange to me that he says he doesn't like doing them when I felt he did so many.
Yeah, but from my interpretation, I think the only two that really succeed at being issue episodes in that sense is How to Make a Killing and Something Terrible, whereas really there are others that feature issues, and yet I certainly wouldn't consider the finale to be like a drugs issue episode, because it almost kind of doesn't care about that. It's very much about Lynda and her reaction to it. There's the idea. It's definitely not an episode saying don't do drugs, kids, because it acknowledges that they're bad and they can kill you, but it's so not about that. And similarly, the suicide in series 1, which I have to admit I've never been completely happy with how that's handled. I think compared to how How to Make a Killing deals with solvent abuse, and how other episodes deal with harder issues, I've always, because it's just entirely about Lynda's reaction. It's there for that, to motivate Lynda's behaviour for the rest of the series. It's kind of interesting actually, in that it's basically the opposite of the trope fridging, where a male character, where a female character is killed off to motivate a man. Like the death and that suicide is entirely there to motivate, which is the opposite of the sort of the genders flipped on fridging. Really,
a very interesting point that plays off what you were just describing is the second part of the quote I was reading out, where Moffat says, "The challenge was always to make the story function for our regulars, despite the tub thumping. Thus, Something Terrible was really about Colin's redemption, rather than Cindy's abuse." So it's interesting he's explicitly framing it as, I'm doing these episodes around my main characters, rather than the side characters afflicted by the issues or the issues themselves.
Yeah. And like I say, I think, as you said, Something Terrible and also How to Make a Killing strike that balance well. In How to Make a Killing, it's Kenny sort of more independent from Lynda and on his own, almost this investigative streak, and I think that is balanced really well. And I think the others sometimes, for what is still a children's show, even if I watched it as, I guess it was 17, so not technically, but watching it as an adult or young adult, not quite the intended audience, I still find it, I think some of the episodes kind of bring up things that they're not prepared to deal with, and the result is that I'm left thinking, to the child's original intended audience, I'm not sure how that would come across. But I don't know, it's a big conversation to get into.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Hooligan, do you have something to respond with?
I can't think of anything as nearly as interesting or in depth to say, so.
I can't, but I know something Moffat said that might pertain to it. This is regarding there are crocodiles, and I think he's kind of framing the episode as like spiteful to a direction to do a drug episode, because what he's saying is they were always at me to do one about drugs, and I was thinking, why? What do I know about it? My answer to doing a drug episode was always, what are any of my characters going to say? Colin will sell you them, Spike will buy them from you, and Lynda will say, I don't give a fuck, it's probably a bad idea, but it's your choice, he says. So of course at the end I did that. I had Lynda not care. I had her go to hell and refuse to apologise. So what do you think of him characterising the finale as kind of an act of spite almost in this way?
Well, I'm of two minds about it because, like, he is absolutely right that that is how Lynda would react. But I also just find it really sort of unpleasant to watch. Just like the absolute sort of lack of... Well, she does. It's not that she doesn't care, because she does say in the episode that she does care, but just not that much. But it's like, I think the series up to that point had shown that Lynda could be really, like, the Gazette looks like a really difficult environment to work in. I'll put it that way. But because Lynda is so, she comes across as inconsiderate to the employees and like,
yeah, for good reason.
Yeah, and they I think there's that story beat about like the employees trying to use Spike to negotiate for like kinder labor conditions, basically. And it's like, surely we could have Lynda maybe sort of go through a little bit more introspection, as opposed to having this major hero moment being sort of just like, basically, fuck you, got mine, I'm successful. That's how it came across to me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we've already, I think it's fair to say that Moffat is definitely, no one would think he was above spite in his, an act of spite in his writing. We've already mentioned Brian McVoy, so, it's kind of, and obviously, the finale is the first time I watched the finale, I completely did not know what to make of it, because it's such a odd, just thing, and it's, I mean, yeah, when you put it, the specific thing about it, it's like, oh yeah, the finale is the main character literally goes to hell, in effect. It's whether it's a dream sequence or well, it's not, because obviously there's a literal fire, but obviously there's the... It's a strange one, isn't it?
Yeah, I felt like it was a very kind of cynical episode. Like, it kind of takes everyone's kind of worst traits and kind of extrapolates from that what would happen. Like, Lynda's just completely callous, and that breaks her relationship with everyone off. Like, Colin just finally out and sells the paper. Like, it's just like, see ya. I got a better offer. Like, it felt very cynical, I guess.
I kind of like it because I feel like it feels like if the series is always flirting with, turning these young adults into adults, or turning these children into adults, it feels kind of in tune with the premise of the series to quite cynically go, well, if they become adults, they're not going to be, nice children. They're going to act like adults. They'll be scumbags.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really... The cynicism is the word. And especially, again, for a show which, regardless of the age of the characters at any point, the target audience still being children, and it's CITV, and yes, it was very much the sort of prime time-ier slot for CITV, but was more for the older, but it's still, it goes to places at times where it's interesting that they just I think Moffat must have had so much freedom, and possibly has never had that much freedom again in the entire rest of his career, which, considering it was his first job, is quite a wonder.
Yeah, I think that being on kids' TV, it's like he probably felt like he didn't have as many critical eyes on the program, like, than he would making something like Joking Apart or Coupling. Like, he feels like he's flying under the radar a little bit. That wasn't the case, obviously, because like Press Gang got a lot of attention. But I guess writing a kids show, he would have felt like he had room to experiment and basically follow his own interests.
I guess it's good to leave audiences with like a contemplative finale, like a finale that'll have them unsure what to make of it, because then they're going to be talking about it, like we still are so many years later. Like, I'd much prefer getting this than like the series 4 finale, if that was a final ending or something like that. I think something that characterizes the finale interestingly, and I mean, this is never eventuated, so we can't read too much into it, but of course there are times when Moffat or Julia raise the idea of, a film set after the series or whatever like that. So there's a Moffat quote from 2004, so I think that's Coupling era, where he says, I'd leap at doing more press gang. I love those characters, but I wouldn't know what Spike and Lynda are doing now till I sat down to write it. I expect they separated long ago and are pursuing very different lives, each occasionally wondering what happened to the other, but both confident that their paths are unlikely to cross again, until one day... ... What do we think of his comments there?
Yeah, I think the idea, like, I like that, and I think that is probably realistic to how you would write that as a one-off reunion special or as a film. I think, I don't know, I still think sometimes that the premise of Press Gang has the potential that you could full on do another series of it, but if you did, it would have to be about different young people, and it's kind of whether that was ever really what Press Gang was about after the first, and especially after the second series. But yeah, I think that as an understanding of Spike and Lynda's relationship, the fact that there's almost no world where they would actually be together in the present is, he has that. I think that's what probably most viewers would interpret from it, and so the fact that he has that awareness himself, Moffat writing it, is not surprising. Yeah.
I feel like this is just a result of a few doing more. Obviously, Lynda's alive and not actually burning in hell. But it's interesting how close we got to more Press Gang 2, because in 2008 at the Jekyll Rat party, Moffat got drunk and he pitched the idea of a reunion special to the head of drama at the BBC at the time, and he got approval for it, but then he said he was too busy with Doctor Who to actually go and make it. But it's crazy to think we nearly did get that.
I'd love to see that, frankly. Just like hearing the idea of Lynda and Spike reuniting, it's sort of like just electric when you even just hear it spoken, let alone seeing it play out on screen. And like there's the whole behind the scenes significance of it, of like, Moffat and Julia and Dexter. And I think that like moving it into modern day, you'd be able to do a reckoning of like the implications of new media and how the actual journalistic landscape, or you could just continue the metaphor of like writing, like what television looks like now. And I think that would be fascinating. And I hope it happens. I'm not sure it will, but I would love to see that.
On that behind the scenes note, so Moffat and Julia, the actress for Lynda, get along fine. Like they were interacting happily on Twitter this year, 2020, when the first series of Press Gang went up on BritBox. What's the deal with Moffat and Spike's actor, Dexter Fletcher?
Well, okay, I'll only briefly touch on this, but I think that like it's well documented that Dexter Fletcher, during the early stages of his career, had some brief or semi-brief dalliance with drugs, and that coincided with his time on Press Gang, because that was sort of his big break as a non-child actor. So it's interesting in that context that like Moffat chose to write There Are Crocodiles, or responded to the brief of writing a drugs episode in such a condemnatory fashion. And I heard that
it contextualizes that 2004 quote where he said like Spike will use them as well. Quite interesting.
Right, yeah. And I read that quote where he said that Spike would use drugs, and I thought that was what was going to happen in the finale, and I was actually a bit terrified. But I was glad that it didn't pass that way. But I also heard that like one of the reasons Spike wears sunglasses so much on the show is that like he would, essentially stay up very late into the night, sort of, partaking in these vices. Which is kind of a really morbid thing to learn about a kids show.
Now, this is cruel, but the thing to watch in this scene is Dexter Fletcher's eyebrows. Now, watch them seriously, because he's determined to carry on acting here, and so he knows he's got glasses. Oh, there you go. All right. That's semi-surprised. They do a lot more in this scene. Because it's not one of Spike's greater moments in the show, but he eyebrows it up.
Why did he wear those glasses? Oh yeah.
There you go.
Did you? Was it written in that he had to wear those?
I think it was. I can't remember why. Oh, no, I do remember why. Dexter, and if you're out there, Dexter, I apologise for this revelation, but he liked to stay out late at night. I don't know what he was doing. I think he's probably helping old people or something. And he'd come in with bags under his eyes that honestly, they should have been on a carousel, so he used to take these dark glasses on him.
And it's also, like, interesting that Moffat turned Spike's sunglasses into such a essential part of his character. Like, there's that really great gag where Lynda has to wear sunglasses so people don't recognize her, and Spike has to stop wearing them so people don't recognize him.
Yeah. The other missing piece here of the behind the scenes stuff is, of course, that Spike and Lynda's actors were dating throughout the series.
Paranoia that if you see someone
nice
early,
in that suit, doesn't he? Sorry.
So you're flashbacking in a very major way now, aren't you?
Now was this the...
What?
Just remembering something in the back of that cab.
Really? Well, I don't think you can leave it at that.
What is this? Is this the second series?
Second series, yeah. This is your...
I think we might have had a little private kiss.
Really?
So I'm sure Dex won't mind me saying that. Yeah. I'm sure we did.
Just a bit of a snog in the back of the cab.
I think we might have had a bit of a snog, yeah.
Blimey.
I thought you would have known that by now. Oh, me? No.
Look at those lips. Weren't you frightened?
I think, don't be cruel. I think...
Spike, I think you're getting the wrong idea about this kiss.
Oh, I've forgotten all this.
Oh, no, absolutely not. This is just a good night kiss, a thank you kiss between friends, right?
No, it's all very sweet and romantic.
I knew you were getting
I think I quite enjoyed doing this at the time.
Did you really?
I've gone all shy and bashful.
Oh
my God, dearie me.
And that ended after the series.
And I'm sure it's part of the reason why they are so good on screen together. That it is something that we're really experiencing.
It's probably worth bringing up. Dexter Fletcher is a huge success these days. He's like a big time director of feature films. He's doing very well. So that's very nice.
Yeah, maybe he could direct a press gang reunion, you know? It's these are things I like to think about. I think the sort of stuff he directs is more or less, it's like not that far off tonally from the kind of stuff Press Gang does. So it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility.
Could you ever see it happening at all, or do you think the time is really well and gone now?
I think the time probably has gone, and yet I can think in. I know how I would do it, and whether that has any correlation to how it would actually get done but I think fundamentally you could take the premise, have a whole bunch of new young people, and have Lynda in a sort of Mr. Kerr kind of role, and then use that as a way into occasionally bringing in other characters from the original series in different roles and where they are now, while basically fundamentally having that there but making it about new young people and focusing on them. I think if you tried to do a story that was just, them as adults, I'm not sure how interesting that would be, or who, it would appeal to us as fans, and yet I'm not sure that it would really work that well. But I can't see Moffat returning to it at this stage, and whether anybody else would, seek to reboot it and get his permission seems... Yeah, so I can't see it happening, and yet I know exactly how I would want it to happen if it did happen.
Yeah. This is on a different tack now, but what do we think of the episode that has the actor for the Valeyard from Doctor Who in it? The episode totally not about Doctor Who.
I mean, it's very clever. I think I had a friend who hadn't seen Press Gang, who had read the premise and saw Michael Jason and was like, "Is it full on about literally basically Doctor Who appearing?" It's like, well, it's not quite, because it's a sort of, it's a wider genre parody, and there's clear influences from, yes, obviously Doctor Who, but also James Bond and the Avengers, and many sort of very British, but that all those sort of cult type shows, and it's very fun. I don't think it's the best episode by any means. In fact, I think it's probably somewhere below half, and yet it's immensely enjoyable to watch. And there aren't many episodes that centre Fraz, and I think it's nice that is one that does that. I think the only other example I can think of off the top of my head is the chess one. Is it called whatever it's called? But
Picking up the pieces, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting because the first episode has that sign at the front door of the Gazette. Is it trespassers will be exterminated?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So he doesn't go overboard with it. Like, I think we have slightly more Doctor Who references in Coupling.
Yes.
Where we have Steve mentioning Daleks, and then in Series 4 there's quite a few of them. But yeah, I think it was a lovely little pastiche episode. It was a nice little story of the actor. I feel like you could easily be a few steps ahead of the episode and work out what's going on, but I don't think that's really an issue.
And Michael Jason actually is just very good in it, is the thing.
Yeah.
Like, if you've only ever seen him in Retrial of the Time Lord, nothing against some of Trial of the Time Lord, something against Mind Warp, but that's for a different podcast. But you wouldn't necessarily know from that Michael Jason is a very good actor, and I think actually when you see him in Press Gang, he genuinely, I really like the way he plays it, and yeah, and it's nice to have those sort of, well, I suppose he's not necessarily a big name actor, but big name to us at least, and it's nice to have that there, somebody recognisable, and obviously, in the first two series, I'm as a Doctor Who fan, very much any time Angela Bruce is there, I'm like, well, it's Brigadier Bambera,
Yeah. The Bambera character also had a really great scene with Billy, the tetraplegic. I think this was in Series 2 where she interviews him. And it was a very sort of subversive kind of scene, because the whole scene is basically about she basically expects him to be like the inspirational figure, which is like sort of the default expectation for people with disabilities when they appear in the media, is that they are like the ultimate inspiring figure. So for basically people to look at and say like, oh, that's reassuring. But Billy is like sort of freaking her out and just like giving these incredibly sort of clever, wry responses to her questions, and basically explaining that like, it's like his disability is not something that fills him with inspiration every day. It can be like really difficult, and it's like another example of how Moffat sort of avoids just doing the most obvious thing with the writing.
I think it's all enhanced by the fact that even in 89 and 1990 or whatever, the actor for Billy, that's him. And so I think that helps the realism or the interesting, unexpected ways the character talks to people. And that obviously he's reading from a script, but I assume Moffat's kind of drawing more from how the guys told him it actually goes in reality, rather than that kind of patronising fawning over people in wheelchairs like you tend to see.
Yeah, definitely. Some of my favourite quotes from Press Gang are sort of the ones that are basically Moffat commenting on the process of storytelling. So there's one where like, it's sort of a tossed off, a bit of like a clever wordplay sort of line, but Lynda is talking about breaking a story. I think it's Lynda anyway. And she says something to the effect of, it's too interesting to be interesting. So like, it's just like the big sensational headline grabbing story is not what you want to go for. It's like the stranger sort of questions underneath the surface that really produce the major intrigue. And there was another one that I loved, which is, I think she says like, if the answer isn't interesting, you make the question bigger. No, I just love all that stuff where it's like Moffat sort of giving his characters a little bit of wisdom in the dialogue.
Do we have any other favourite little episodes like that?
I think I've sort of already briefly mentioned going back to Jasper Street, which I think it's definitely one of my favourites, and it gets talked about less than I think, a lot of episodes around it, but I really do love getting to see the young Lynda and Kenny. Like, those scenes are really well, like the children they got for that are really good, and it's very well written, and just generally the sort of mystery element of it I really like, and the fact that it's not like, I think the fact that the mystery and the revelation of it isn't something sinister. Like, it's quite a Moffat thing to do, to sort of set up a mystery and then play it off in a way that isn't what you expected, or at times, and it does do that very well. And I suppose it's a thing that people critique Moffat for a lot later in his career, the fact that quite often he'll set up a mystery and then we'll say, actually, the mystery's not the thing that's important, which is very much, I mean, that's fair in... So the most obvious example in Press Gang is probably Love and War, where there's the mystery of what's inside the briefcases is like brought up quite early on, and then at the end of the episode when the briefcases are opened, there isn't anything in them, and it's the briefcases are actually the thing that are valuable themselves, and obviously that's there. You know, the story is a vehicle for Spike coming to terms with and admitting to Lynda about his father's death, and the mystery element is kind of left by the wayside, which is similar to what a lot of the criticisms around Moffat's Doctor Who stuff, especially Hellbent, often come down to. It's just like, you set up this mystery, we started to care about it, little did we know that you didn't care about it, and you just wanted to, you know, get rid of it and go on to the emotional thing. But yeah, I like that.
I love that shot cutting through time where like Lynda looks behind her and like sees Kenny walking. I find that such a magical moment in the episode. I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, going back to Jasper Street, it's also one of my favorites, but what I really like about it is kind of, I guess, that feeling of like accessing a lost past or something that you've forgotten type of thing, and getting that finality. I really like that, and there's just a lot of nice things like the transition between the young and the old, and the dreams and how it kind of plays with that, and like the title card. It's just, there's so many things to appreciate about that episode. I really like it.
And do you have a favourite Neo that you'd like to... I'm just curious.
I really liked... I wasn't as fond of Sarah later in the series, but I liked her quite a lot in Series 1, so I liked that very early episode of her cousin, was it? That was the English teacher struggling with his class.
Yeah, One Easy Lesson.
Yeah. I thought that was a charming little story. I thought that was quite good.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's almost like a vision of what a slightly, you know, a version of the series that was less experimental and that was less and more episodic and more could have been like, and it's very good at doing that. You know, it shows that Moffat could have written that version of the show.
And we have Colin doing the pings in it, which is one of his more cartoonish ideas, I think.
When I did a watch through of the series that I was sort of tweeting along with, I did for a while, I remember being surprised by how early that came up, because it's the one sort of Colin plot I always remember, the half thing more than the fact that it's there in the third episode. I was sort of surprised by like how quickly it got to that.
Yeah, it's always fun to watch out in the background, all the stuff from Colin's antics and whatnot show up. I always like that.
Yeah, that episode where he's like that huge turtle costume.
Yeah, Colin has a lot of interesting costumes. You know, the pink bunny is obviously, you know, a classic moment, and then obviously there is that thing in At Last of the Dragon, which the less talked about, the better.
Yeah.
If I could just say my favorite episode, I think.
Yeah.
I think it's my favorite episode. I really, really love The Rest of My Life, which is Spike under the collapsed building. I think, yeah, we fought about this a little bit, because you were distracted by the vision of Spike cheating on Lynda.
Yes, I found it alienating.
And you said that he should have been held accountable for his dreams. And I disagree. I think that like the whole episode is about like alienation and sort of it's about things being put in perspective, and it's about like how Spike having this extraordinary experience puts a gulf between him and Lynda, because like Lynda is so detached from like the real world. Basically, she's in the bubble of the Gazette, and she has tunnel vision like about the whole event. Like she only cares about Spike, and Spike has an experience which like just expands his sort of emotional palette so much. So it's kind of like awkward for them at the end of the episode. And that dovetails into like the whole ending of series 2 where they develop a rift. Because series 2 is so well structured. Like it is sort of, everything feels purposeful.
It's funny you say develop a rift because the striking visual in that episode reminds me of Torchwood. Shot from fragments where the glass from the ceiling is like looming down onto Owen, potentially going to hurt him really bad.
Yeah.
I thought it was quite a similar setup in Press Gang there.
Yeah, I can see that. And just the whole, I guess, just the self-contained nature of that episode where it's, seeing a death happen is so, like, confronting. And basically just I felt like the episode had a really strong premise and I thought it carried it off really, really well. And it sort of has a neat little companion episode in Lynda getting trapped in the bank vault. And I like that episode as well.
Me too.
And I like how they don't actually resolve, like they fail in saving her at the end.
I loved that.
Yeah. It's just that feeling of that feeling of irresolution and like you can't really solve these problems. It's like very good metaphor for relationships, I guess, is that like there'll always be something uncomfortable that you can't quite resolve.
The Vault episode is interesting to me because it is techno-fast, but it's not funny. But I feel like the pile-up of miscommunications that has to happen for them to get right outside the vault and not solve that she's in there, that does kind of read as... comedic is the wrong word, but I would say fast. Like it's a collision of a lot of amusing or interesting coincidences that cause a huge misunderstanding and things to go wrong. It is that. So it is fast.
It's very, like dramatic irony and comedic irony are really just like, very close bedfellows.
Hooligan said something interesting earlier about going back to Jasper Street about like an unaccessed part of childhood or like a lost part of childhood. It reminded me of in the Series 3 premiere, Spike has this great line because Spike gets quite philosophical sometimes, and he says, "The past is a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live here, And I think it's interesting, like just taking at face value, that's a really interesting line, very kind of lyrical, but also the kind of roulette the show does with cast members, I think creates this kind of interesting nostalgia as you go on, and sometimes it gets paid off, like when we get certain cast members suddenly back. And sometimes we like feel the sudden sense of loss, like when Kenny's suddenly gone after Series 3. I think it's really interesting what the show does with cast members because it feels not so motivated by like real world issues with the cast, like actors joining movies or whatnot, even though it was that. But it kind of just feels like how people flit in and out of your life, especially, 17, 18, 19, the ages that the characters are at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good, like at the start of it, they're like high school, students, and I don't speak to anyone now that I went to high school with. I know, and then there's maybe like half a dozen people from college that I still speak to, and that's only like less than a year and a half ago that I left there. And so it's obviously it's a good point that it's the sort of thing you can get away with there, but you couldn't necessarily with an adult drama where they leave just because they leave. Because in an adult drama, Kenny going to Australia, you'd have to have a big reason for that. Whereas in this drama, it's like, well, presumably his parents decided to move to Australia, and as the child, even though he's a bit older by Series 3, he doesn't get much of a say in that. Which is, it resolves some narrative problems that you might have afterwards. Even though it's still a shame not to get a goodbye for Kenny, it does actually sort of reflect that thing in life, as you've said. Yeah.
And I love how they still mention, like, Kenny still gets talked about. I hate it on shows where a cast member leaves for whatever reason, and then the show, it's almost like it tries to gaslight you into, like, they never existed. Like, they'll never get mentioned when they totally should have been mentioned. So I love that Moffat doesn't tend to do that in his shows.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it tells you interesting things, like how Lynda, like, conflates or pretends to conflate, like, Sam and Julie. Like you're the blonde, graphics person. I can't differentiate between you. It's interesting what characters like really take stock of, the people who come in and out of their lives, and what characters are so wrapped up in their inner worlds that they don't really care that much.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. The thing about conflating Sam and Julie, I think, is also a sort of a bit of a joke about the fact that, as Moffat, I think, acknowledges himself on the audio commentary.
Now, in the first series, this part really was played by Lucy Benjamin, who came back later, who played Julie, and she was so good, I wrote her part up for the second series, and as a mark of gratitude, she declined to be in the second series, went off and did some awful vet sitcom with Paul Nicholas, and so I just changed the name on the script, and Gabby came in to play Sam.
Did you? You just changed the name?
I put in some information. But the odd discontinuity is in the first series, Julie was portrayed as quite sort of dim and couldn't spell, and that was the only joke, and I thought I'd play up her character a bit in the second series and make her sort of feistier and flirtier.
Yeah.
But of course she wasn't in it, so it was Gabby that did all that stuff. But when we brought back Lucy as Julie, we just gave her Sam's personality. It's an outrageous lack of continuity.
Also, the person who played Danny, I think, left at the end of series 1 again because he was getting nothing to do. So there's obviously a bit of, which I suppose, part of the difficulty of writing an ensemble show. And obviously, Moffat seems very aware of the fact that these actors left because of what he was doing, in effect. And I find that interesting, his sort of, when he talks about that on commentaries, he's just like, I didn't really give them much to do. Oops.
It's interesting because these next few shows with such smaller core casts, it's like Joking Apart is for 5 people if you count Trevor. Coupling, really isn't that many. Chalk really isn't that many. Mm-hmm. So I guess that was much easier to handle.
So but like 7 as a number isn't that much more than Coupling, which has 6. And yet I think Coupling has 45-minute episodes. And Press Gang, everything about Press Gang is pace and quick and energy. I think it's even Moffat's writing style is very much symptomatic of the energy of youth. It's a lot less controlled and precise than, say, like the Peter Capaldi era of Doctor Who, but it just has this energy and pace, which I think invigorates it a lot of the time. And yeah, when you've got that many characters in that short space of time to tell an episode, it's not really surprising that you've got to have that speed. Yeah.
When I think of Coupling, I think of like that 6 as a unit. And frankly, when I think of Press Gang, I think of Spike and Lynda. So it's kind of interesting in that way. Although like Colin and Kenny and Julie, Press Gang does have really good supporting characters, but it feels much more like the Spike and Lynda show.
There's something very interesting about the series and the way so many stories deal with technology, specifically communications technology. Like there's a number of stories where the plot hinges around something to do with phones, and as I suppose it's more fascinating now when the way these phones work is very different to so the whole story where Kenny is speaking to this stranger in Ireland because of the switchboard being done wrong. Like you couldn't tell that story today because that's not how that technology works. And similarly, the opener to series 3, the thing with the answer machine messages where it's physically recorded onto a tape, and where obviously it gets the wrong tape, but then they put the tape in their own tape machine. And even just like Linda's struggle to deal with her phone, which has like all the different buttons, like it's, and I think, I'm not sure, and obviously there's the episode quite early on that focuses on like the internet as well, which is one of the first things on television to deal with the internet. And so I'm not sure what I can get out of Moffat's clear sort of interest and fascination with technology that runs throughout it, or what the point of that is. And yet it's definitely there in the episodes.
It's interesting, in the Joking Apart commentaries, he characterizes that kind of thing as techno-farce, and he almost seems to kind of regard it as cheap, maybe because it seems to be outdated like so quickly. But I don't know, for other people, I think it's kind of interesting novelty when you watch stuff from the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, and like the society and the technology is so different. They have these total different contrivances for the stories. I think that's really interesting, but maybe to some people it's dismissible.
I mean, I think on that note as well, and the techno-farces, like you say, is a really good term, and probably the best episode of Coupling is the one that is just pure techno-farce.
Oh, yeah.
It's all the "G'day, Bruce's Bar and Grill." And that's all I remember from it off the top of my head. But like it's easily the funniest and most exciting. And like you say, it's taking that thing of just, here is phones, here is technology, and here is the humour we can get out of them. And I think, but I do wonder, as well as the potential for comedy from those things, whether it does speak to a wider interest in technology as well. Because I think going way later in his career, looking at his sort of the Peter Capaldi of Doctor Who, there's all this stuff about the storage of memories and virtual reality and AI and stuff, which is clearly, again, he's, even though he doesn't necessarily know much about these sort of technologies, he's clearly interested in them and the idea of them. And I think there's that's a really good point. That's a really fascinating thing. It's like in Extremis, how like some of the ideas there are a little bit dodgy as it pertains to his understanding of video games or how numbers work, but like the core of his interest in the technology is so interesting. He does it so interestingly. Like his fascination with it is really endearing. That's really interesting to track how his interest in technology has changed through his career. I love that. That's really fascinating.
It's just sort of a random observation, but I think the Press Gang, stylistically, out of all of Moffat's shows, I think Press Gang feels like a prequel to Sherlock more than anything.
Interesting.
And I think you can observe in the fandoms of those respective shows that, like, clearly Moffat was drawing from some kind of like internal or a common interest in making those two shows, because they are both so heavily fixated on a relationship between two people, and they are both so mystery driven. And like, Press Gang has some really Doyle influenced episodes. So I think it's interesting how he could turn a show about a kid's newspaper into like something where you feel like, you know, the heart of all good and evil could be at stake, basically. So I think Press Gang and Sherlock, they feel very similar stylistically.
You know what might be nice to end on actually is just asking our context with Press Gang. Like, how did we come to watching Press Gang? Like, for me, it was a combination of utter fascination with Steven Moffat's career, as well as the very healthy reputation this series still enjoys through online word of mouth. What about you, Hooligan? How did you come to watching this show?
I mean, for me, I guess it was mostly you and your fascination with Steven Moffat, which got me interested in Steven Moffat. But it's definitely like an accessibility thing here, because I'm in Canada. Press Gang wasn't really a thing here. Like, no one knows about Press Gang, and when I try and recommend Moffat shows to other people, they're like, yeah, where do you watch that? I'm like, about that. But yeah, no, definitely Moffat.
Yeah, pretty much similar to some of the other stories. Like, I obviously really liked Doctor Who and Sherlock, and then I sort of was curious about what Moffat did outside of that realm. First, that brought me to Jekyll, you know, not that different from those other shows. Then Coupling and Joking Apart, and which sort of, I don't really make a habit of watching like old sitcoms, but those really surprised me with the sort of creativity and how non-conventional they were. In some ways, they're less conventional than Doctor Who even, because because they deal with the ordinary world. Moffat has to come up with like really creative ways to make it so sort of subjective and everything. And then I put off watching Press Gang for ages because I thought, well, first of all, it's 5 series, and second of all, it's like a kids show. So I thought there would be a limit to how good it could be, although Doctor Who is a kids show, but that's neither here nor there. But then I watched it, and of course it was fantastic and warm and interesting. And most of all, because like you, I am chronically obsessed with Moffat's career and his writing, I really just sort of luxuriated in the sort of rawness of, because this is his first writing project, essentially, other than the theatre stuff he did. I really, I was hooked on like the fact that you could see him learning how to write.
And what about you, Bryn? How did you come to the show?
Yeah, I mean, I was aware of it. You know, I'd read about it being Steven Moffat's first show. I'd already started quite a while before going through Russell T Davies' back catalogue, and I was interested to do a similar thing with Moffat. And when I watched Press Gang, I was blown away by it, because I like Coupling, but it's very messy and uncomfortable at times. And like, I really like Peter Capaldi of Doctor Who, but I have mixed thoughts about Matt Smith era and other stuff Moffat's done, and I have mixed thoughts about Sherlock as well. So for the press gang to be so sort of consistently good and enjoyable for me compared to my generally more mixed thoughts about Moffat stuff, it probably is my favourite Moffat show.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, unlike the show, we've come to an unambiguous ending.